Oh, hey, come on in. Let's go talk about pocket knives. This project is a beautiful case. I think it's a 6249, I believe is the number. I'm terrible with case numbers. Yes, 6249 Case Copperhead. Got a little bit of rust on the pen blade. But our problem is broken spring for that main. The good news is Mike from Braden, Florida sent another one for parts. This one has a worn main, a broken blade, but two good springs. All right, let's get into it and have fun with this project. I'm using the tried and true razor blade method in Dad's old vise in order to cut through these pins and disassemble the knife. I'm going to speed up the video for the disassembly. It's fairly routine. I will leave the pivot pin alone, spread the layers of the knife out like a fan, then remove these springs. I have to gently pry some layers apart to get them started, and I will remove the cut pins as I go to get them over and out of my way as I work. I measure both springs that I just removed with the calipers, and I find out that they are the same thickness. Then I compare them to the springs from the parts knife, and these two are very different thicknesses. The spring that fits the main blade that come out of the parts knife is 0.110 inches, or 110 thousandths, which is far too thick to fit anywhere on this knife. The parts spring, or the spring that came out of the parts knife for the pen blade, is 0.089, which is 2 thousandths of an inch thicker than that broken back spring that I just removed. This should be close enough to work. I will check the model numbers on the knives again, and they're both Case 6249 Copperhead knives, but they were made about 20 years apart, and that matters. It seems that the profiles of both springs are slightly different too, so I do a test fit to see how it's going to work in the knife. I'll put the replacement spring in the pen blade, and the original pen blade spring I'll move over for the main blade. If this spring doesn't work, I can discuss some options with Mike and see where we want to go. This replacement spring is recessed into the knife on the back. I test the blades and find that they work well, though the pen blade does sit a little bit proud. This is a sign that the spring fits differently inside of the knife as well as the outside. Now that can be adjusted, but I'm unsure of what the owner will think of it, so I'll set this project aside for a few days as I contact him for further guidance. After looking at the pictures, Mike chooses to go ahead and use this spring for the repair. So I'll pick the project up again in a few days and see if we can complete the job without encountering any further problems. These temporary pins fit correctly, so I think they're about to become permanent pins. For anyone new to my channel, I'm about to peen this pin. First, I will file the end flat and smooth. Then I will hammer the end of it to compress the metal on the end of the pin, flaring it outward, kind of like making a head for a nail, only a lot smaller and more subtle. Then I will cut the other side of the pin to the correct length and repeat the process. This holds all of the separate layers of the knife together into one piece. This knife has a total of 3 pins. The pivot pin, which goes through the blades, is the first one. I did not need to cut or replace that for this knife. This center pin is the one that I'm pinning now, and lastly the end pin, which I will do next. The center and end pins were the only two that held these springs into place. I almost messed up on this pin. As I peened the first side, the pin slid up into the knife, and when I flipped it over, I barely had enough pin sticking out to peen it. I thought that I might have to cut a new one, but we had just enough to work. Now, as you can see, the flared end of that pin is sticking out like a zit on a prom date. So we're going to sand that smooth and even with the bolsters. Now, this is fairly quick to do, but then afterward, I'll begin sanding the knife smooth at the back springs as well. That's going to take a bit longer. On most knives, I'll sand until everything is flush, but with this older replacement back spring sitting recessed into the knife, I can only even things up a little bit. I cannot make it match the other springs or the liners. Now I will switch from a 220 grit belt to a 400 grit and sand everything all over again. The coarse grit belt removes more metal and gets things into place, and this finer grit belt smooths out the sanding marks from that first belt. You could do everything with a fine grit belt, of course, but it takes far longer and it creates too much heat. Heat can damage the knife. Now, if you're going to do knife repair on a budget, I recommend starting off with a cheap sander, but with good belts. If I were doing this for a living, I would try to have both, but as a hobbyist, I believe that your money is far better spent on good quality belts than on expensive equipment. Here I'm doing just a little bit of hand sanding to smooth down the back springs. The sander has left a sharp edge on each side of that recessed spring, and I want to smooth those sharp edges so that it will be more comfortable in the hand. This pen blade has some rust spots on it. I thought that I would be able to clean it by hand, but it proved to be worse than I'd expected. So I'll move over to the sander in just a minute and take care of it there. Now the blade has a concave grind to it, so I cannot sand it on the flat part of the belt. I've tried sanding a blade like this against the small wheel of my sander other times before, but this is the first time that the curvature of the wheel matched the curvature of the blade. This 180 grit belt makes short work of cleaning up the blade. Now I can't get it perfect as the rust has pitted the metal too deeply, and I would have to grind away far too much of the knife to get rid of all of those rust spots, but it does greatly improve the look of the blade, especially after going back and smoothing those grind marks with a 400 grit belt. That rear bolster and the back spring needs to be polished the most, but I'll hit a lick at the top bolster and the handles just to make everything shine the same. It would look strange if we had just shiny spots on certain parts of the knife but not on others. And then I'll even spend a little bit of time polishing the blades as the owner wanted them polished up. Hey YouTube, I thank you for taking this knife journey with me today. This has been a fun project and the knife turned out very good considering the problems we encountered. Of course, the problem that we encountered was that the back spring from the older parts knife did not match the same design as the new knife. This is something I've heard of before, but this is my first time encountering it. That is, that Case changes the design of their knives sometimes, but they keep the same model numbers. So both knives had the same model numbers, but they were a good 20 to 30 years apart in design, and things were different. The older parts knife, the two springs were different thicknesses. The new knife, they were the same thickness, so I could not move both springs over. We only replaced the one, and it was the one that came off the small blade of the old knife, so I put it in the small blade of the new knife. The blade that came, or excuse me, the spring that came off the main blade of the parts knife was much thicker. And if I tried to use it, it would be so much thicker than the blade would be loose in the handle, and we didn't want that. So we used just the one spring, got it put together, and everything fits and works. It just looks a little different with it sunken in. I feel it in my hand more so than see it. The spring also stuck out a little further at the end. It had a slightly different shape here, but I was able to sand that down to match. I could have sanded more of this down, the rest of the frame and the other spring to match, but that would have removed too much metal. I believe it would have weakened the main spring of this knife. We'd already had one break. I did not want to weaken anything any further, so I just smoothed it for appearances and left this replacement spring sunken in. The blades have good snap. They look good. They polished up good. The pen blade had some rust to begin with, and I don't know if I can capture this in the light that I have, but I have a couple of spots of pitting. See, they're on this side where the rust was a little deeper, and I sanded out what I dared of that. I could have gone further, but again, that would be removing a lot of metal, and I did not want to remove too much metal from the knife, whether the blades or the spring. Because when you do that, obviously you weaken it. And any amount of sanding or polishing is removing part of the knife that was there. So I didn't want to do too much of that. But still, it's been a fun journey. The knife turned out well. It's a beautiful knife. It'll be a very good user. It could be one that you could put up if you wished, but it'll never be a museum piece after having been repaired. But still a great knife, and I'm happy with how it turned out. I wish I could have done more with it as far as making that work, making the spring fit better. Perhaps I could have looked around, shopped around, see if I could buy a knife for parts or find someone who had a back spring for it that would fit it better. But that would have taken several weeks delay. As it is, it's taken me longer than I'd hoped to get this project finished and back to Mike. But I hope he's pleased with it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for all you do. May God bless you. Goodbye.